Let's go on the record. This is an evidentiary hearing before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission in a cause docketed before the commission as cause number 46069, captioned as Verified Petition of Duke Energy Indiana LLC for approval of an electric vehicle make-ready credit tariff and approval of an alternative regulatory plan, ARP, and declination of jurisdiction to the extent required under Indiana Code 812.51 et seq. Notice of the time and place of the hearing was given as provided by law by publication in Marion County in the Indianapolis Star on August 7th, 2024, and in Hendricks County in the Republican on August 8th, 2024. These are newspapers of general circulation, and these publications were made at least 10 days prior to the date of this evidentiary hearing. The proofs of publication of the notices have been received by the commission and are now incorporated into the record of this cause by reference and placed in the official files of the commission. Notice has also been given to the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counselor and other interested parties. May we have appearances, please?
Thank you, Your Honor. On behalf of Petitioner Duke Energy Indiana, Andrew Wells and Beth Hennigan, 1000 East Main Street, Plainfield, Indiana.
On behalf of the public, Lorraine Hitz and Adam Cashin, Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counselor, Indianapolis, Indiana.
Thank you. Mr. Wells.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, a petitioner would move to admit into the record Petitioner's Exhibit 1, the direct testimony of Jean V. Perez. Exhibit number 2, the direct testimony of Roger A. Flick II. Exhibit number 3, the rebuttal testimony of Jean V. Perez. Exhibit number 4, the rebuttal testimony of Roger A. Flick II. Exhibit 5, the docket entry the commission issued in this cause, or excuse me, the response to the docket entry that the commission issued in this cause. Exhibit number 6, the verified petition in this cause. Exhibit 7C, the supplemental response to OUCC's data request set number 5. And exhibit number 8, the company's response to OUCC data request set number 8. That is all. Thank you.
There's no Exhibit 7, just 7C. Is that right?
Correct.
All right. Are there any objections from the OECC?
No objection, Your Honor.
Hearing no objection, petitioners exhibits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7C, and 8 are now admitted into the record of this cause. Ms. Hitz.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, we'd offer what were previously marked for identification as Public's Exhibit number 1 and 1C, the testimony of witness John E. Hazelden, and Exhibit number 2, the testimony of Brian Latham.
Any objections?
No objection, Your Honor.
Hearing no objection, Public's Exhibits 1, 1C, and 2 are now admitted into the record of this cause.
Public rest. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I know. No, I know.
No, public does not rest.
Yes. Mr. Wells.
Darn it. Just kidding. At this time, petitioner would call to the stand Ms. Jean Perez. No, we don't need him now. Thank you.
Ms. Perez, can you raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm the evidence you will give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You may be seated. Mr. Wells.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Perez, could you please state your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Jean Veron Perez.
Would you please tell the commission by whom you're employed and in what capacity?
I work for Duke Energy. I am the Director of Regulatory Strategy and Collaboration.
You have what should be marked in front of you as Petitioner's Exhibit number 1 and Petitioner's Exhibit number 3. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you please tell the commission what those are?
Petitioner's Exhibit 1 is my direct testimony for the application of the Make Ready credit program. Petitioner's Exhibit 3 is my rebuttal testimony for the application.
All right. Thank you very much. The witness is now available for cross-examination.
Ms. Hitz.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Perez.
Good morning, Ms. Hitz.
And I guess, sorry, before we get started, because of conference at 10 a.m. We are going to close at 9:50, pretty much on the dot, so for now. So, all right, thank you.
Duly warned. Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Flick is not here today, but are you generally familiar with what his testimony was?
It depends.
Okay, fair enough. In your direct testimony at page 8, line 1 and 2, you refer to Duke's request in this case and the Make Ready credit as adding revenue to the system without adding cost to the system. Do you see that?
I do. I will note that it is part of a sentence.
And that's fair enough. I mean, you feel free to turn over to page 7.
Okay.
And I see there that it's Duke plans to pay or requests authorization to pay financial credits based on the first 2.5 years of estimated revenue associated with the charging of the EV, and then after 2.5 years, the ongoing increase in load, and we turn over to page 8, adds revenue to the system without adding cost. Is that correct?
That is what my testimony shows.
Okay. And on line 2 of page 8, we're carrying over from line 1. You say that provides a valuable contribution to the fixed cost of service that otherwise non-participating customers would be required to pay. Is that correct?
That is what my testimony says.
Okay. Now, let me just back up a little bit. Duke is asking for authorization to give credits for the installation of EV infrastructure, as well as for the contractor's costs to install that equipment, correct?
That is not correct.
Well, it's not going to own the equipment.
That is not correct either. The Make Ready credit program is a program that incentivizes the wiring and circuitry associated with getting the premise ready for the installation of a level 2 EV charger.
Okay.
It is not incentivizing the cost to install nor the actual level 2 charger itself.
All right, well, taking the word incentivize out, because I want to keep us to dollars and cents. Assuming that a customer is incentivized, now I know this program exists, Duke is offering this credit. That credit would help someone install a charger by paying for the installation of the equipment itself. Not for the equipment, but the installation, and giving them a credit based on estimated amount of revenue. Is that correct?
I want to make sure that we are distinguishing what the incentive pay for. So the incentive is getting the house ready. So it is the wiring and circuitry of installing the house and making sure that it's ready for a level 2 EV charger.
Okay.
It's not the actual level 2 EV charger itself.
Right.
And that's important because when we pay for the incentives based on what is on the demonstrated invoice or the invoice provided when either the contractor or the customer submits the incentive, we only incentivize the wiring and circuitry for getting the premise ready for the installation of the level 2 EV charger.
So you're getting it ready for a charger that Duke has nothing to do with, but you are helping to pay for the wiring to get it ready for that for a charger to be installed at a later date.
Correct.
Okay. And you are basing your costs or proposed costs on, as you said, on page 7, the first 2.5 years of estimated revenue associated with the customer charging of an EV. And when I looked at Mr. Flick's testimony, he talks about how Duke wants to recover those costs. Duke is asking that it be allowed to create a regulatory asset for the amount of money that it expends for these credits. Do you understand that as the request?
I do. Unfortunately, I will not be able to speak to the mechanics, rationale
fine.
of the
I'm not-
cost recovery that's in Mr. Flick's testimony.
Yes, I understand. I just wanted to establish that you understood how Duke is requesting to recover this cost.
We can establish that we are recovering the cost. The how, I would definitely defer to Mr. Flick.
Okay, well, so the request is for a regulatory asset upon which Duke would then earn a weighted average cost of capital, and that's established in Mr. Flick's testimony. Do you know that?
I don't have Mr. Flick's testimony in front of me, and I really will not be able to speak to.
Subject to check, would you agree that's how Duke is asking for recovery?
Subject to check, yes, but I really did not read through Mr. Flick's
All right.
testimony.
I'm not making you responsible for him, that's for sure. I just wanted to set some guidelines. So assuming a customer receives this credit and thereafter purchases a charger and begins charging their vehicle, they all have to be Duke customers to get this credit, right? It's not something outside of Duke's territory.
Duke Energy residential customers.
Okay, fair enough. We want to differentiate between the commercial and other customers. So when that customer connects to Duke's system to charge their vehicle, they will be incurring a bill from Duke for the energy used. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Let me rephrase it. It was not very articulatedly said. When you use electricity, if you're a Duke customer, you get a bill for the use of that electricity.
Yes.
Okay. And so people who are charging their cars would get a bill for that electricity.
Yeah, yes.
All right. So assuming that a person has a vehicle being charged on Duke's system, subject to this credit, Duke will be receiving revenue as a result. That's an increase from what the residential customer might otherwise have had without the charger.
I apologize. I don't believe I understand the entirety of the question, specifically from the first part where you mentioned something about the incentive as well as the revenue. I apologize. I'm not able to
All right.
do the correlation.
Well, I'm looking at your testimony on page 8, starting at line 6 down to 11, where you talk about the expected cost that customers will bear. Instead, the credit is built on revenue the utility will collect from the expected EV load on the system. Do you see that?
I do see that on my testimony.
And you further state on lines 10 and 11 that the program creates downward pressure on rates, thus benefiting all customers in the long run. And that's based on Duke getting that revenue. Is that correct?
Ms. Hitz, this question, as I am reading the entirety of the question, is referencing whether or not the program is beneficial for residential customers. So therefore, it really talks about the downward pressure on rates and how we conducted the downward pressure on rates analysis, which is the rate impact measure test.
And that's called, can I just interrupt? That's called the RIM test,
That is
right?
called the RIM test.
Okay. And I appreciate you referring back to the question in your testimony. Let's just move on. I think your testimony says what it says on lines 10 and 11. I was simply quoting that. Based on the receipt of that revenue, you're saying rates will come down because Duke will receive more revenue as a result of incentivizing these chargers to be brought on the system.
That, Ms. Hitz, again speaks to the RIM test, where the RIM test looks at the incremental revenue associated with the EV charging as the benefit of the program.
All right, Ms. Perez, I appreciate you expanding your answer, but I'm specifically asking about the increase in revenue to Duke. Can we agree that if those chargers are installed as a result of this credit, Duke will receive more revenue from its customers?
There is that incremental revenue
Thank you.
associated with EV
All right.
charging.
So the downward pressure on rates, do you understand generally the rate-making process in Indiana?
And
Okay, fair enough. I might say the same thing if somebody asked me that. The downward pressure, though, is based on increasing revenue coming to Duke, which would offset other costs. Is that correct?
the downward pressure on rates relates to how our RIM test is approached, which is the revenue associated with the incremental consumption of EV charging.
Okay, Ms. Perez, I appreciate that, but my question was a yes or no question.
Can you repeat your question again, Ms. Hitz?
Your Honor, may the court reporter read back my question? Okay.
Yeah, if you
All right.
can rephrase it, that
That's
would be
fine.
great.
You state at lines 10 and 11 on page 8 that the program, and that's the Make Ready program, creates downward pressure on rates, thus benefiting all customers in the long run. And that's based on the incremental sales on your line 9 there from the adoption of EVs. So if I translate that to say it's because Duke will get more money from its customers, therefore depressing the rate impact, is that accurate? That's a yes or no question.
So, Ms. Hitz, any considerations of rates, rate impacts, and revenues, I will defer to Mr. Flick, as he is the best person that can really construct well and respond well on how this program will impact our rates. This statement pertains to what the RIM test does, which is identifying whether or not the program produces downward pressure on rates.
Okay, well, I agree that Mr. Flick discusses rates in more detail, but you've got this information in your testimony. So my question again was, it's because Duke will get more money and will offset other expenses that you are saying this. Is that correct?
Your Honor, objection. Ms. Hitz has now asked this question, I think, 4 times.
Well-
And the witness has indicated what downward pressure and rates in her testimony is referring to, which is the output of the RIM test for her testimony. And she has also deferred questions on rate making to Mr. Flick, who was the company's making witness in this case.
Well, Your Honor, my response is that I've asked Ms. Perez this question several times in different ways, but I haven't gotten the yes or no answer that I was attempting to get.
What is the question? I don't understand your question either.
Okay. I will be happy to try and put it in as plain English as I can.
You said it, and there was no precedent to it, so I don't know what it was, like, if that makes sense. Like, it was there were multiple clauses, and I just was
All right.
extremely confused. So if you could try to rephrase it one more time, that if you want a yes or no answer, I think it needs to be rephrased.
Thank you. I think I'm just going to move on and see if I can get additional answers from the following. So you refer to the RIM test on page 8, going further down. Can we agree that the RIM test generally, to show a positive effect, should be a number that is over 1, not under 1? Oh, please say yes or no.
Any benefit cost analysis needs to be over 1.
Thank you. And you indicate on page 9 at the top that Duke's calculation of the RIM test was 1.41. Is that correct?
That is what my testimony says.
If you can turn to page 16. Line 11 down to,
Hang on, Ms. Hitz, I apologize. I'm a very slow page turner. Bear
That's
with
fine.
me.
I always find if I'm under pressure, I manage to miss the page.
I'm on page 16.
All right. And you're talking about how the credits for the Make Ready Credit program are calculated, and you say there again, based upon projected system revenues generated by consumption and demand. So,
Can you point to the specific lines, Ms. Hitz?
yes, 11 through, actually just 11 and 12. Do you see where you said that there?
Yes, that is, I do see the based upon the projected system revenues on my testimony.
All right. And you go on to say, carrying over into line 13, that you used, you, meaning Duke, Duke used consumption data from several Duke residential EV programs to estimate the incremental residential EV charging annual consumption, annual energy consumption. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do see that on my testimony.
Did Duke include the data from the other Duke Energy EV charging programs with its evidence in this case?
I don't believe I understand the question.
You make reference to Duke using consumption data from several Duke Energy, so that is the wider Duke world of utilities, several Duke Energy residential EV charging programs to estimate the incremental residential EV charging annual energy consumption. Did you include, you meaning Duke, did Duke include the data from those several Duke Energy residential EV charging programs with your evidence in this case?
That data point that was used to calculate the credit is in line 16 of my testimony.
I see that you've included an analysis that based on the data, company estimates, and you give an analysis there. But did you provide the underlying data used and taken from those other Duke Energy residential EV charging programs in the case that Duke filed?
Ms. Hitz, underlying data is broad. And as you would probably perceive, data encompasses a broad range of information. So specific to the estimate of the incremental EV consumption, that is in my testimony in line 16. If you can clarify for me what you mean by underlying data.
All right, let me back you up to line 12 and carrying to 13. The company utilized consumption data from several Duke Energy residential EV charging programs. Did you include the consumption data that Duke used to calculate or to estimate the incremental residential EV charging annual energy consumption? Did you include the consumption data with Duke's testimony in this case?
Ms. Hitz, it's the 2,700 kWh per year that is cited in line 16 of my testimony.
And Ms. Perez, with due respect, I understand you're referring to the average, but based on the data, you say on line 14, or I'm sorry, 15, based on that data, when you say that data, you're referring to the consumption data from the other Duke Energy entities, is that correct?
My line 13 testimony says the company utilized consumption data from several Duke Energy residential EV charging programs, and that estimate is 2,700 kWh per year and is cited in line 16 of my testimony.
And as you reach that analysis, you say based on that data, line 15, the company estimates. Did you provide the underlying data used to reach that conclusion on line 16?
Ms. Hitz, data encompasses a variety of different definitions.
Well,
So,
Ms. Perez, let me just stop you.
okay.
That may be true, but I am making reference to your words based on that data. However you defined that data, was that data part of the evidence offered by Duke in this case?
It really depends what you mean by data. A data point to calculate the credit is that amount right there that is in line 16 of my testimony. If you can maybe provide me an example of what you mean by data.
Well, I was attempting to use your own words to get an answer from you about what that data meant.
That data point is the 2,700 kWh on line 16.
No, I would disagree with you, Ms. Perez, and the reason why is you say that the company used data from several other programs, and based on that, so based on the information you got from those other Duke Energy programs, you came to the conclusion, based on that, the company estimates that customers will use XYZ. So based on that data, the data produced your conclusion on line 16. How was that data offered by Duke, other than by the conclusion? How was that data produced to support Duke's case when you filed in this matter?
All the information and data points to inform the analysis of the program was provided throughout the course of this proceeding. Okay.
May I ask then, if the data was produced throughout this proceeding, what you're saying in essence is that it was not provided when Duke filed its petition. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
Well, let me ask you a question then. You said that the data was produced throughout this proceeding. Does that mean in response to the OUCC's data requests?
Ms. Hitz, data is very broad. Data, okay.
Ms. Perez, I understand that data is very broad, but do you understand what a data request is?
Of course.
Okay. So when I say that the OUCC sent data requests to OUCC, I'm sorry, that OUCC sent data requests to Duke, you understand that those are questions asking about the case, correct?
They are questions asking about
All
the
right.
case.
So my question was, you said that the information to support the average or whatever we're referring to on line 16, based on that data, based on your answer, has been provided throughout this case.
As well as in testimony,
Let's just pause for a moment. I appreciate that you're referring to your testimony. So when you say that it's been provided, how has it been provided? Was it in response to the OUCC's questions?
Ms. Hitz, again, data is very broad. So when you ask how is it provided, I would question what data specifically would that be?
Your Honor, I would ask that the witness be instructed to answer the question that is being asked, which calls for a yes or no answer. I asked whether or not, in her words, she said that data has been provided throughout this proceeding. I asked, does that mean in response to OUCC data requests? And her response was, well, data's complicated.
Your Honor, just in response briefly, I believe Ms. Hitz asked 3 questions before she got to the final question. So I think that there may be some confusion taking place in the layering that is taking place in the questioning. Ms. Perez is not a lawyer, and she did not file the case or handle the litigation of the case. So I think there may be some crossing of wires that is taking place in the questioning.
Yeah, I think that's what's happening. It is my understanding that you are trying to ask the data that resulted in the 2,700 kilowatt hours per year figure. You're asking about that specific data, is that right?
Well,
The underlying data.
the underlying, I mean, that's the Duke's conclusion. But I'm referring back to line 12, when the company used consumption data from several Duke Energy residential EV charging programs.
Correct.
And so then on line 15, based on that data, the company came to a conclusion. So I asked, is that data attached to Duke's case in chief?
I think part of the problem is just using the term "that data" is, I think you may need to define exactly what you mean by that for this question. That I
Your
think
Honor,
might
I would
solve-
respectfully point out that I'm using the witness's own words. Whatever is meant by that data, in Ms. Perez's own words on line 15, I don't have a better definition because there isn't one there.
That's fine. I don't think you phrased it that way before. So if you want to say, okay, the question is, as I understand it, you want the definition of what that whether that data, which is on line 15, that term, in quotes, that data, whether that information was provided to the OUCC. Is that correct?
Well, yes, and how was it provided?
Okay.
I believe Ms. Perez's
Do
statement.
you understand, Ms. Perez? Does this clarify for you at all what the question is?
Not really. I apologize. I know it states consumption and demand. Consumption and demand is a variety of AMI interval data. Data is a very broad term and could also encompass thousands and thousands of line items. It's very difficult to define what underlying data mishits is, even if it relates to that data.
Can you ask your question one more time? And I'll note that if you don't know, I don't know is also an answer.
Okay.
Okay. Now, Ms. Perez, this is your testimony, and you wrote this testimony. So when you wrote the testimony on line 15, the language on that, you are saying, based on that data, your words, the company estimated and came to a conclusion, carrying over onto line 16. I am asking about what you meant when you said that data.
That data encompasses all data points from our EV analytics group, from data from other Duke Energy jurisdictions in order to arrive at the anticipated incremental consumption associated with the Make Ready credit program.
Thank you. Was that data attached to Duke's case in chief in this case?
All the pertinent information was submitted along with the testimony. Consumption and demand data is an all-encompassing broad term where our analytics group looks at in order to estimate the incremental consumption associated with EV charging.
Thank you. Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes, let's go off the record. And just noting the time, we have about 10 minutes till we need to stop for a few minutes for conference. Let's go back on the record.
Now, Ms. Perez, do you have the document that's been marked as cross-examination Exhibit 1 for the OUCC?
I do.
And the first sheet in that document is Duke's response to the OUCC's data request 1 pertaining to the calculation. The particular question at the very top says, please provide the data and calculations supporting the estimate of annual and monthly kilowatt used to charge EVs. And were you responsible for drafting the response?
It was done by me or at my direction.
And your response says that the data and calculations is based off information from various residential EV charging load. That's also what you said in your testimony, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did you provide, in response to this request, data and calculations?
The information was provided responsive to the data requests. The data and calculations supporting this information encompasses thousands and thousands of data because it is based off of meter interval data.
Okay. Did Duke provide that underlying data to the OUCC when it asked this question?
The thousands of data points that was used to calculate the information was not included as part of this response because it would be a large, voluminous data.
Well, did Duke let the OUCC know that it was so voluminous they couldn't produce it?
So we provided the response to this question based on how it was asked. We did not receive a follow-up question from the OUCC requesting for the underlying information to provide the data coming from the Duke Energy Indiana Off-Peak Credit Program as well as the North Carolina Make Ready Credit Program.
Okay, well, let me just ask. That first question, please provide the data and calculations, seems pretty straightforward. If that's the question that's asked and Duke doesn't provide the underlying data, isn't it on Duke to explain why it wasn't provided?
Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Hitz is mischaracterizing the data request that is put forth. She didn't read the entire question, and I would argue that the response to the data request also provides a fulsome explanation as to what was explained.
Well, let's just look at that response. In response 1.07A, you, Ms. Perez, state that there were the measurement, okay, let's back up. The support of the estimate of annual and monthly kilowatts is based off information from various residential EV charging load measurement programs. Did you provide the information from the various residential EV charging pilot programs in response to this question?
Again, objection, Your Honor. Ms. Hitz is mischaracterizing what was asked here. I would argue that the data requests speak for themselves, and I think as we have moved along here today, we have admitted numerous sets of data requests. Ms. Perez has already testified earlier that the information that Ms. Hitz keeps asking about was provided throughout the litigation of this case. So I don't know if it would be more efficient if we just move to admit the data requests and we can move on, but her picking little pieces here and not reading the entirety of sentences, I think is misconstruing what is actually said on the paper and will be confusing for the witness.
Your Honor, my response is that I'm trying to get the witness to tell me what was produced, when, and how.
I mean, I may have heard wrong, but I thought she testified, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it would be too voluminous to produce this data.
However, Your Honor, my questioning is that Duke never said that. They never said, we would produce it, we have thousands of lines of information. I will move on. However, I think my questions were founded on the questions that the OUCC asked and the responses we got.
All right, I think this is probably a good place for us to go off the record for conference, and so everybody can just, well, we'll just move out of here, and I think everyone can leave you can leave your things where they are, I believe. If you just want to stay where you are, that's fine, too. Let's go off the record. Amy? You just stay here.